There's an old proverb that says that you die twice, once when your body dies and once when anyone who remembers you dies.
It certainly is heartening to know that that these people are not forgotten, like many of our ancestors and relatives. We keep them alive in our thoughts and in our hearts.
Well, the Orange Hill Cemetery is not the oldest cemetery in Tampa. It's not the largest cemetery in Tampa.
And it dates back to 1927. This is one of the advantages of a large cemetery such as Orange Hill that we're driving through right now is it's a good-sized cemetery, and there are lots of roads that you can drive to get around and see where you're really interested in perhaps exploring or doing a little more research. I always tend to be interested in older stones, only from the perspective of the symbology and the architecture and the design are always interesting. Sometimes you'll see on stones, you'll see where someone is from, where they were born, or where they died, or you'll find information about their military activities. And that's always interesting. Driving through Orange Hill, we see a whole lot of interesting headstones, footstones, and other types of markers. But the ones that really captured our attention are right up here on the right.
So this is where George and I decided to stop the car and get out and start walking around a bit to see what stones we could find. And we were looking for something different that stood out. We were looking for something that attracted our attention, such as a stone with a picture on it.
I'm always interested in the medallions that show up, the different types of architecture and ornamentation on stones.
So it didn't take long as we're walking along here. Suddenly we see a pair of stones that are white, not gray like the typical stones, and that have medallions on them.
And of course I had to stop and look at them.
Yeah. And what we see is not what we expect, because most times I see two side-by stones with medallions, I would expect to see a husband and wife, and we found instead a mother and a daughter.
Yes.
And the next thing we noticed after we looked at them and looked at when they died is we saw that they died on the same day. And they died April 21st, 1940. Their medallions are of a mother and a daughter dressed in clothing of that period, and the little girl has recently turned 12 years old. And we wanted to know what story was behind the death of a mother and the daughter on the same day. Yeah, that's what drew our attention, both the pictures, which not very many of the tombs, the graves in this particular cemetery have pictures. That's a small number that do, very small. And the fact that it was a mother and a daughter, not what you might expect a husband and a wife, and that date of death. You know.
And so, of course, we started speculating. I had to know more.
Right.
So
what would cause a mother and daughter to die on the same day?
Maybe there's an auto accident, maybe there's a murder-suicide, maybe there's a home invasion, maybe there's a disease. You just don't know. But we decided that these people, we wanted to learn more about them.
And even more important, who do they leave behind?
Yes.
Who else is in the family that they've left behind?
Yes.
The very first step in our research on this story about this mother and daughter was to go to a database. We're very fortunate to live in Tampa, don't you think, George?
Oh, absolutely.
Because we have this thing called Trails, and this is a volunteer database that is available for free on the website of the Tampa Hillsborough County Library System.
Yes.
And volunteers have gone through all the back issues of the Tampa Tribune, and they've actually gone and recorded the dates
and back through its predecessor newspapers back to the 1860s.
Yes.
And they've recorded every single obituary and funeral notice that's ever been printed in one of the newspapers there.
So it has the names of the individuals, it has the dates in which the obituaries appeared in the newspaper, and that means you can just search it, put in a name and put in a year, and up pops what you need. So we put in Milton, the family name, we put in 1940, and up pops the exact, the same dates that we're looking for, and the pages on which you can find the story, which is the story of their death.
And there actually were two entries. One was a funeral notice, and the other was a notice of their deaths, and it actually was a news story. When we went into the library and pulled the microfilm, sat down at the readers and started pulling these things up, all of a sudden we find this article.
So we're looking at this newspaper article, and it also makes a reference on another page to their photograph. And here is this enormous photograph on the newspaper page of the mother and the daughter together, just the two of them. And we immediately
guess what they're wearing? The same clothing that they were wearing in the cameos on the Stones. So it was obvious that photograph had been used and cropped into two cameo photographs.
So we saw them two together as mother and daughter, and we saw the story.
It became very, very poignant what had happened to them, and they came to life for us because now we could see them as a mother-daughter pair, as a part of a family unit in life. Yeah. And the fact that the story told us, the news story told us that the accident occurred just a few blocks from where the daughter was going to school. And so, and then we learned a little more about the family. The little girl had stayed the night before at her uncle's house.
This was on a Saturday night.
On a Saturday night, and we later learned that she had a sleepover with her cousin who was a year younger. And what happened is that her mother went to the uncle's house to pick up the daughter, to take her home, to change clothes, to go to Sunday school.
So this was on a Sunday morning. And the uncle and the family didn't live far away from each other,
no.
But they had to go by a railroad crossing and then the daughter's school to get back home. And there were no witnesses, and no one. The only ones in the car were the mother and the daughter, and they were killed instantly by a train. And
they didn't hear it.
There's speculation that it was windy that day and that they didn't hear the train whistle. So that's the story, and the fact that it was a front page story. The story went on to say that many people had died that year from train accidents, yes. Cars and train accidents. So it was not completely unusual, but it was certainly something that completely tore this family apart.
Yes, it did.
And we went on to look at other records to learn more about this family.
Well, we wanted to, when you read the obituary and you see that the survivors include a father, and the father's name was Jesse, and Jesse was an automobile mechanic. And there was a son, an older son, who was 15 years old. It turned out that young Gloria was only 12. She had just turned 12 the month before.
We actually learned, though, that actually she went by Christy. She was Gloria Christine.
Yes.
And that she went by the name Christy. But we didn't learn that until we got the information from the first cousin.
Well, what we found was that the father, Jesse, he went on, he did not remarry. He buried his wife and daughter here in Orange Hill Cemetery. And then in 1945, in October of 1945, he appears in Tucson, Arizona, and has apparently been there for 3 days. and he dies. And he dies of a coronary thrombosis and bronchial asthma. And so he is shipped back for burial here in Tampa, and he was buried in an unmarked grave. We didn't know where he was. We could find no place where his burial was recorded.
In fact, our local genealogical society in the 1980s had put together an 8-volume set trying to list where everyone is buried in Hillsborough County, and those books list Jenny and Christy.
Yes.
But did not list Jesse. And we also remembered having been to this cemetery when we first looked and found the mother and daughter next to each other. We remembered we didn't see a father buried here. But then we took another look at the newspapers, and the story basically said he is buried in Orange Hill Cemetery.
Yes.
So we said, well, he must be here somewhere, but he's not in the cemetery book. So that meant calling the cemetery office and speaking to a sexton to get the actual records and say, is Jesse Milton here in this cemetery?
And indeed, I got a return call back from the sexton, and he gave me the lot number and the plot. And he said, yes, he is there. He is buried right beside his wife.
And we learned that from looking at sexton records and talking to individuals that had talked to the sexton and checked those records.
Yes.
And we could verify that Jesse was indeed here. We just couldn't see there was no marker to let us know
that. But we went on to see what other kinds of things we could find. And what we did come across were at Ancestry.com. We were looking at World War II enlistment records going from 1939 to 46, and we found an enlistment record for Charles E. Milton, the son.
But again, this is a son who's in the military and who has already lost a mother and a sister, and now just a few years after that he's lost his father. So he's the last of his family, and other than uncles and cousins, he's it.
He went through a great deal at a very young age to end up as the sole surviving member of his family. Well, it turns out it shows his occupation as a sales clerk, shows him having completed 2 years of high school, which tells us he dropped out of school probably 1941. He was enlisting as a private first class, and that indicated to us that he was re-enlisting. So he had been in the Army through those years. We also found divorce indexes.
Right. We looked at Florida. Florida has records of that type for marriage and divorce.
He was divorced in 1951 and again in 1954. And ultimately, that was almost the last record we found until we began looking around for death records. And the first place I went to was the Social Security Death Index to see if I could find anything for this man who had been born in 1926, 26, and to see what had happened to him. Well, it turned out, I finally found him, and he had moved to Ohio. We found evidence in an Ohio death index that he in fact had died in 1985. So here we are. We found the full track. We found him once again.
One of the things that really helped us put flesh on the bones of this story was the use of the census records and the newspaper accounts. And both of those tell us things about the family. They tell us exactly where they live. They tell us what the occupations were. And we're able to actually put those on a map. Parts of Tampa have certainly changed, but many of the streets are still exactly where they were. And you can actually look at a census record from that time frame, from 1930 even, and from the newspaper accounts of the death. And you can put those on a modern map and go, this is where the house was that the Miltons lived. This is the house where the uncle lived. Here is the intersection where the train would have struck the car. Here is the junior high school that Christy and her cousin would have been attending. And you can actually draw a map and a line and go, I see exactly the route they would have driven to go from the uncles to their home right through to that intersection. So combining both the census records that told us locations of homes and the newspaper accounts that said where they lived, putting all that together,
and
pieced that together.
And the obituaries gave us names of other relatives and helped us relate these people back and forth to one another and to reinforce those relationships, and then to plot them out in the census map just to see how closely the family lived, and they obviously were a close family. But the thing that I guess Drew will attest to the fact that I was very upset by this story. It is very poignant that all of a sudden a mother and daughter their lives are snuffed out, and a father and a son are left behind. The father doesn't survive 5 years. The son drops out of school, has some unsuccessful marriages, goes into the military, and left Florida. Maybe he even ran from Florida. And to try to get away from all the unhappy memories. We just don't know. Drew actually sat down and put together a genealogy database of the entire family so he could understand what the relations were between all of these people, so we could understand who the players were. And that was very, very helpful.
Well, that was one of the ways in which we were able to discover living family members, and it was the living family members who could at least still confirm the story. What we knew was, again from the census records, that the uncle that was being visited had a daughter who was almost the same age as Christy. And we were, so I was curious as to what happened to her, but unfortunately did not know what her married name was.
That's always a trick.
It can be very difficult to find women in records, because once they're married, if you don't know who they marry, then it can be very tough. So as it turned out, though, we were mentioned the uncle also had remarried and had several children with his second wife, and I found an obituary for one of them. And so this meant that, so I'm looking at this obituary for the uncle's son by the second marriage, and it mentions a half-sister with her married name. Suddenly I realized this is the Betty, this is the cousin, and now we have her married name, and we're able to look at property records to see, my goodness, she still is living in Tampa.
In Hillsborough County.
That's right, and now we know the name of her and her husband, and it now may be possible to contact her.
It was very devastating for the cousin at whose home Christy stayed the night before she was killed.
She remembers it to this day.